Okay, I'm ready. Pavel, you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It is just past 9 a.m. in Portland, Oregon on Friday, the 24th of July, 2026, which is just 5 weeks and 1 day from the anniversary of Skynet gaining sentience, which is on Saturday, the 29th of August. You should put it in your diary and we can all celebrate. Coming chopped up into packets, hopefully delivered in the right order and without any jitter, through software built and sold by NASDAQ listed Zoom Communications Inc. that opened at $85.22 today with a market cap of over $25 billion and whose website title is One Platform to Connect, weirdly inviting you to autocomplete with a J.R.R. Tolkien reference. I am Dan Hon, and this is How People Work Live, complete with an exclamation mark, as if it's a 90s TV show. It's episode 3, and today we have Pavel Samsonov. How People Work Live is a live show based on the themes of my workshop for helping teams become more effective, focusing on getting you the hard results by teaching and practicing the soft skills that you don't get taught. Over 4 weeks, I work with cohorts to help them improve their relationships with other people, whether that's coworkers, teams, managers, stakeholders, customers, anyone with a brain and a mouth or who can type. We learn together how to understand where and to whom we need to be influential and how to do it without being icky. We practice how to communicate clearly and succinctly to give your work the best chance of succeeding. And when we've done all of that, we wrap it all up in tying it into your organization strategy, whether your organization actually has a strategy at all. But that's me describing it, which was very, very difficult for me to write because I'm English. Here's what Jeff Ma, a director of technology, strategy, and engineering, had to say, which is it's a crash course on how to form direct, empathetic, honest, and strategic relationships with other humans to get hard things done in complicated organizations, which I think should be well worth paying for. Today, I'm delighted to have Pavel Samsonov with us. Pavel, on top of over 15 years of experience as a product manager and UX designer at industry leading companies, also writes the Product Picnic newsletter and is prolific and very, very professional and proper on Blue Sky, aren't you, Pavel? Yes.
One of those things is true.
One of those things is true. Pavel's LinkedIn bio also says that he's a human native designer, which to me, at least, is the perfect blend of defensible snark crossed with thought leaderism. And I'm sure he'll love me describing it that way. Pavel's newsletter goes out every week. And well, he and I get on because I agree with everything in his newsletter, whether that's saying that thoughtless features never add up to a thoughtful product. That's a good line. Empathy and delight mean nothing when software is disrespectful, also true, and that velocity minus intent is waste. Next week, I just discovered, Pavel will be doing an in-person workshop in Philadelphia on influence in design on Friday, the 31st of July. And if you can't see a link in the chat for it, then someone, either Pavel or me, is going to put it in right now. There it is. Here's how the show works. It's a bit like an open panel. Pavel and I are going to start talking about all of the soft bits about how good work gets done. And as you've got questions or observations, just throw them into chat or raise your hand in Zoom if you can find where they've hidden the raise your hand in Zoom button this week. I'll be paying attention and keeping track of the order of questions and call on you. Pavel, we were just talking about when you told me about your workshop that you're doing next week, that part of what I teach in my workshop is the stuff that you don't get taught. So you can be like a great designer, you can be a fantastic developer, you can be good at your job, basically. And at some point, you're going to realize, or you might realize, that you have to influence other people to actually get stuff done. And this can come as distressing to a lot of people.
Yes, it's something that I remember very keenly in my first job, straight out of grad school. And I was like, oh, I'm so awesome. I learned all of these very expensive methods. Expensive because I went to Carnegie Mellon, and that cost me all of my money. And so I thought I was ready. And then jumping into the workplace, I was like, how do I apply all these methods where no one will let me do them? And it took me, some time to figure out no one's going to let you do anything. You have to. do things yourself in a way that fits together with what the organization is trying to move towards. And I think that equally, you should not be doing things that don't fit within what the organization is trying to move towards, which is what we see a lot of today. People will just try and start doing their own stuff, and some of it is valuable, some of it is at cross purposes with what everyone else is doing. And the result is that no value actually gets created at all.
We get to call that alignment sometimes, which just became a meaningless word that everyone hates when they see. Um, I started out as a one of the things that in my very eclectic career, I started out as a baby lawyer. And part of your training as a baby lawyer is that you get to do all the very, very difficult stuff after however many years of training as a lawyer to take a client's sometimes quite simple question, do all the research, and then figure out what it is that your client needs to do. And a good lawyer should be able to make that simple and clear, and also make it really easy for your client to make a decision. And your job as a lawyer isn't actually to reduce all risk for your client. And it shouldn't be. That's one of the things that I got taught really early on, which is that your client's the one who makes the decision. And like in any organization, unless you are the CEO with most of the voting power and the shares locked up, and you're a sociopath like Zuckerberg, then you get to make the decision. But a lot of the time, someone else is going to make the decision. So you need to be able to make that clearly. You need to have a clear recommendation, right? And all of that is you don't. I feel like a lot of people, and maybe you've seen this as well, they get accidentally good at it if they're good at it without knowing how or why they're doing it. Is that something that you see?
I think there's definitely a range of strategies, and some of them are benign and some of them are actively harmful. I try to be optimistic about these things because it's really the only way to survive and stay sane. And
Right.
so I think that yeah, people don't really realize what they're doing. People are trying to just either, follow incentives or build a good product that users will want to pay for. But it can have, side effects on a systemic level because doing the work of building software is not a single person thing. It's not a something that you can do by yourself. And so when people try and intervene in this system with their, idea or whatever they've got, it can result in big problems. One of those problems is something I've written about before that I kind of cheekily called the fastest gun in UX, where people will just run with the first idea they had. And it's
Right.
not necessarily the best idea. It's not necessarily tested or, confident. People don't even necessarily like it, but it was the first to kind of
Yeah.
get picked up within the sort of the noosphere of your company, the
I
semantic environment.
right.
Like people just like think, ah, we're doing this piece of like stupid thing, but they're still doing it.
Yeah.
It becomes the strategy almost by accident. And there are people who are really, really good at doing that, at being the
Yeah.
fastest gun in UX. And we can, you can't just beat them by being faster than them. They're always going to be faster. They don't care about necessarily quality. They're not thinking about it. They're like, oh, I have an idea. I'm going to go and rustle up, a PM and a designer and a developer, and I'm just going to like
Mm.
make it happen. And it's going to show up on the homepage tomorrow. Uh, by certain measurements, that was really effective.
Right.
Their velocity was
They
huge.
shipped a
Um,
thing.
yeah, exactly. Wow, you can put it in your portfolio, but you did this,
Yeah.
and now you're losing thousands of customers because they did this and they didn't talk to anybody. And then they like that kind of just gets swept under the rug. Um, and it takes, a very long time to resolve someone just going and doing something like that.
So that's that. You know, I'm sure that I've experienced people like that. I'm sure pretty much everyone has experienced people like that. Leaf in the chat just described that as bias for action, and I
Oh
know,
my God.
there's some people that I've worked with who would kind of describe such behavior as weirdly magical, and that kind of cult of personality where the right person or certain kind of person comes up with something and is able to kind of magically accrete the resource that they need and then magically persuade people. And it's that part about the magic part that I try to, that's one of the things that I try to work with people about, which is that that person may not know that they're doing it. They may have learned through their entire career that they're very good at doing it. In fact, their career may just be entirely based around the fact that they can do it and that they can persuade people to do something that's the first thing that they thought of, and that they're able to do that. And you don't it is weird to me the number of people who feel like learning how to do that, or the fact that you can learn how to do that, is bad or icky or something that you shouldn't do or is even manipulative. Is that, I mean, like, you're doing this workshop next week. Is I mean, it feels like many people behave that way, or they're like, oh wait, no, like you say, my work should speak for itself. I don't understand. If I just do an even better presentation than last time, maybe that will change the way that people make decisions.
Yeah, and that's kind of something that I've thought about for a very long time, and we cover in the workshop, where we create this narrative, and when I say we, I mean UX designers more broadly, create this narrative around our work that is very self-reinforcing. Because how do you hire a UX designer? You go and you look at their portfolio. How do you
Right,
hire any other role in your company? Is by
right,
not doing that. We are the only ones who have portfolios. And what that does is it reinforces this idea that the thing that is shipped and visible and clickable and delightful is the only thing that matters. It's the thing that moves metrics. It's the thing that gets work done. It's the thing that aligns teams for people who are thinking about that. Like, I'm just going to make this artifact and I'm going to put it in Confluence, and everyone's going to click on my awesome Confluence link and see how well documented it is. And then they're going to go and build it exactly the way that it's documented. And if they don't, it must mean that I need to document it better, or I need to, like, design it better, or et cetera, et cetera. And most of the time, that's not actually the problem.
um,
Speed is a big part of it, actually. Like, it can be the crappiest thing, but you get it in front of people at the right time. Or it's something that people see themselves in. Like, an executive comes up with a really terrible idea, and you tell them their idea is terrible, and what's going to happen is they're never going to talk to you again. They're just going to go directly to developers and ask them to build their terrible idea. So you
right,
kind of have to judo it a little bit to so they see themselves in the thing you are showing back to them. You're not communicating, I did something different. You're saying that I took
right.
your thing, I made our thing better.
Yeah,
And then even if they can't tell the ways in which it's better, they're like, cool, it's my thing. It's the thing that I wanted you to do, and you did it, and now I'm happy. And that's how you stay in those conversations. That's how you stay attached to the work instead of jumping from project to project because all you get asked for is the mock-ups or the prototypes, and then the actual conversation and the actual decisions happen somewhere outside of that process.
and this is where, unfortunately, kind of it jumps into the, well, if I were in a functioning, mature organization that knew what it was doing and was rational, then I wouldn't have to do that, and we would all be smart people, and we would all be deciding to do the right thing. Um, the reason why, and people get a bit confused about this when I talk about my workshop, and the workshop is also based on the consulting that I've done, because I found that with the consulting that I do when I get brought in to do something like a turnaround, it invariably ends up in examining the organization's entire strategy, or at least for that product, for example, or for that service. And and one of the reasons why is that you start, at least the way that I teach this and the way that I approach this, is that when someone comes to me or when someone has that terrible idea, and your first instinct is to say, well, that's a terrible idea, is to be able to stop and think, let's just assume that they are actually trying to do a good thing here. And it's that the idea is terrible and that they don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily know any better. so that, like you say, when you go back to them, you're not just saying that idea is terrible, which is true, but you're trying to understand and be empathetic with the intent behind the idea and trying to elucidate that and then responding to that. Because at the end of the day, if you figure out the problem that they are trying to solve, where they have come to you with, they think they're helping in some cases, right? I think
Hmm.
they're like, I've got this problem, but I already came up with solutions, so that should save you time. So, I'm bringing you the thing.
Yeah.
This is me helping you. Um,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like you say, they're actually solving two problems.
right.
One of the problem they're solving is the business problem, and the other
Mm,
problem they're solving is the problem of explaining to you what they want from you to
right.
help solve that problem. And yeah, they're doing the best they can. They're like, oh, I have a design, and I hate design as a noun, but
Right.
they have a design,
Yeah.
and they send it over, and they're like, can you just like make this nicer? I've already got the shape of the solution here for you. Because they don't actually know what the inputs to a design process are.
It's not
And
their
I think this
job,
is something, right,
right?
exactly.
Like they hired, I mean, like, in theory, they hired you to do that.
Yeah, yeah. There's a quote from my VP of design recently. He's very quotable. I quote him on the picnic sometimes, but this one quote is, "It's not this executive's job to know what we can do for him."
I want to,
And
there's something that I just noticed there, which is so your VP of design, you just said that they're very quotable and that you quote them in your newsletter quite a lot, which I'm just going to assume is a good thing.
it's a
Um,
good thing. Yes, yes,
right.
yes.
And it's almost as like being quotable, being able to distill something down into something that is interesting, memorable, and that you can share with other
Mhm.
people. Like that seems to be helpful to their job and a sign that they can do it well in the whole communication sense, right?
I mean, you would think so, but there are a lot of executives who look at what ChatGPT puts out and they think this is fine, this
Oh
is
God.
cool, this is
Yeah.
succinct, and then
Right.
they put it out there and it's like, all right, we're gonna realign our core competencies.
Right.
Uh, great. What does that actually mean? Well, you're gonna have to go back and read the thing that the VP didn't put
Right.
to figure out what it means. So I think yeah, it's unfortunate that the bar is actually quite low. But yes, I do think that summarizing what you want to say
Yep.
within a sentence or two, and I mean, I call those design principles
Mm,
when I talk about it in the context of work. Like, how can we summarize what we're trying to do so that we can compare what we're doing against this sentence and figure out whether or not this thing is fit for purpose?
right.
And honestly, if you do that for everything, like every artifact you create or every memo even you send out, it's very useful because it's essentially you're designing every artifact that you
Yes.
create.
Yeah.
And so, I'm designing this appearance on your wonderful internet show. And what you choose to do, the way in
How
which you
very IDEO of you, Pavel.
yes, and so you design that thing to
Yeah.
be fit for purpose, but you can't do that if you don't know what that purpose is. And so I actually find that a lot of these stakeholders that try and give you their design um, skipped over the part where they figure out what the purpose is because
Exactly.
they're so concerned with doing the visual
Yep.
that they didn't spend any time on the other stuff. And they're like, here's this thing. And so one of the ways you can push back effectively is just to kind of wind back time a little bit and ask them to walk you through their reasoning. And
Right.
when you give them sort of the benefit of the doubt, because
Yeah.
realistically, what actually is going to be happening is they're going to be reasoning in real time because they haven't thought about it yet.
Right.
But you're essentially creating that space. You're saying, here are the sort of questions that I would have asked myself as I was making this. I fully trust that you have done the same thing. What are the answers
We're
to
going
those
to pretend
questions
that you've done the
that
same
you are
thing. Yeah.
exactly.
Right.
So,
Um,
so it kind of like creates that scaffolding, and that helps them understand what it is you need for your inputs. Because to I think it was Peter's point in the comments, we're most stakeholders still think we're graphic designers,
mm,
and they're like, here's my request, here's my brief, just do this, and then you're done. And the fact that we're so much more doesn't really click for them. And until it does, they're not going to provide us the inputs we need to do those other things. We get
Right.
stuck doing the visuals because that's what they know to ask for.
And just as a side point there, this was something that I was thinking about and I wrote about in my newsletter recently, which is that, the UX and the design, that is the business these days. It isn't, you could have thought about it as a graphic design, but you're actually implementing how you want the business to be run. The thing we've had a bunch of people talk in the comments about, how important it is and how valuable it is, like we've been talking about, to get to your manager or whoever higher up the chain has just handed you this thing, and to try and figure out from them the problem that they're trying to solve. And this, where in my work, I've always kind of pulled this back, and it's illuminated some. Often it illuminates the kind of the staring into the abyss problem, which is there is no strategy there. People don't know what they're doing. They are roughly flailing about, and they have like maybe a vague direction that they're aiming for. So sometimes I find that I need to be careful, because if you start asking the what are we trying to achieve here, it can often be very
Hmm.
threatening, because they are supposed to have the answer. They haven't had the support to figure out the answer. The strategy,
Hmm.
like you say, is often meaningless words. So you end up having to go to like a source document, if that even exists. So often, because we talk about you're going back to solving a business problem, you end up, or you can end up, I feel, in the situation where you're trying to single-handedly manage this entire stack of what is the business trying to do exactly, and how is this, but for some reason this is my job. Or if I want to have a more sane environment and if I want to succeed, I've got to help figure this out to do something that is actually going to help or solve the problem in the first place. I have to help figure out what that is.
Hmm. Yeah, the problem framing. And this is the part that I think takes us back to our theme because problem framing is social. It
Yes.
is 99%, if not 100% social. The problem framing only matters if you and I share the problem framing. That's what makes us a team. And I've been part of working groups, which are not teams, where the problem was we have not launched this feature, and the solution was launch this feature. And in those circumstances, design can't do anything valuable. And I mean, no one's really doing anything valuable, but we're the only ones of whom the question, what is the ROI of UX, actually gets asked. And we can't answer that because no one can answer that. No one knows what the point of their work is. You just kind of take on faith that it's valuable and then they go and do it. And so I think that this problem really is only solvable far upstream of when that kind of question gets asked, or very like much earlier than we ask today. What's the value of doing this? Um, because then there's still time to actually talk about. Wait, we don't have a goal. We don't have a theory of victory, to borrow a term from I think Clausewitz, but possibly someone else. It's a military thing. But yeah, there's no plan, and when it's too late to make the plan is when people are going to get mad at
Yeah.
people who are pointing out that there's no plan. But when the plan is still coming together, us being in those rooms is absolutely critical because we can say, okay, well, in order for me to do a good job, I need to know, let's say, which user behavior is going to drive the metric we care about. And that's kind of obliquely implying there needs to be a metric. For example, there's not always a metric, but if we don't have a metric, then you're letting people know that you're missing an input because they're going to say, well, we want users to click on this thing. Well, I guess clicking the valuable thing? No, it's actually something else, but it's easier to measure clicking. And then you think about how can we measure the thing we actually care about instead of just optimizing for something that's easier to measure but has no real value.
A lot of the time, Jock just brought up something that we've talked about before on this show, which is this kind of broader point of people don't like to be wrong, because generally we're going to assume that they'd like to not make mistakes. There is massive social cost in looking like you're wrong in front of other people. And one of the ways that I try to explain this to the people that I work with in the teams is that it's not a bad thing to help your boss look good.
Hmm.
Um, that is probably one of the things that they are trying to achieve. Your incentives and your outcomes can be totally, that doesn't mean that your incentives and what you're trying to do are misaligned there, right?
Hmm.
You can both win if your boss looks good at doing their job and you look good um,
Hmm.
at doing your job. And often one of those tricky things, and I think a lot of it for me, the way that I teach it comes down to trying to be very deliberate in understanding, the emotional posture of someone or kind of the context, and which a lot of people might just say is like find the right moment to say something or find the right moment to do something, which is when is it going to be slightly safer, like you've been
Hmm.
talking about, to kind of introduce this, what are we what what are we doing here, or to kind of put it in that kind of questioning context, or even to kind of put it on someone else. It's easy as a consultant to come in because I can just put on my hand and say like, hey, dumb question, I don't really know what you do here. Can you explain it to me like I'm five or something like that? The other way that I've done it is to kind of gently, and like you say, even with artifacts, right, even with presentations or emails or stuff like this, is to go back even to the extent of, well, what's the point, like what's the sign on the building outside, what is the highest level thing that we are trying to achieve here, and
Hmm.
almost kind of like therapy, like just start asking those questions gently so that you can get to, all right, everyone can start to realize that the first thing that popped into someone's head to start doing, which might not even necessarily be the worst thing to do, it's like a
Hmm.
thing to do, and how distant that is from what we're trying to achieve. And then maybe there are other things that we can also think of that might achieve an aim that we have together rather quickly elucidated and improved upon rather
Hmm.
than just directionally. Um, and it's
Yeah.
persistent work, right?
This was something that I kind of tried to do myself in my first job as a PM. I was like, oh, I've heard that metrics are important. I'm just going to go and make my own metrics. And then, I defined some things we could measure. They went up. I went to my management and I'm like, look, I made these numbers go up. And crickets in the room because no one cared about those numbers.
Right.
They didn't know what numbers they cared about, but they knew those weren't the numbers.
And we're supposed to care
So,
about numbers in general, right? Because then we're rational
right,
people.
right. The other thing that you touched on, and I think is really important, is the idea of losing face and being wrong kind of is actually it often pushes back against the need to measure things because if you measure things, then you find out you're wrong. That's scary.
Yeah.
If you just release something without measuring it, then you can just take credit and leave, and someone else's problem, is going to crop up in a couple of years' time, fixing the things you broke. But design and especially research and testing is a kind of measurement. And so when designers say, I want to go and test this thing to see if it's good, stakeholders hate that. They push back and they say, well, I think it's good already. You don't need to test it because my opinion is really the only opinion that matters. Go and release it. And this was, I think, one of my first articles that I ever wrote around design is the art of being wrong safely. And it's safe for the company, it's safe for the designer, and safe for the user. In this particular case, being wrong safely for yourself means that you're not staking your reputation on the line, which means you're not burning trust with a stakeholder. You're not creating this anticipation that the thing you do is going to be correct on the first try. And I think that because that's how a lot of other roles work, and you never iterate, you never come back to things, that becomes the expectation for designers. So that you're going to come back with a thing and it's going to be the thing that users want and you're going to get it right away because you have empathy and you can put yourself in their shoes. And that is how terrible designs happen because it's not actually an effective way of doing this kind of work.
There's something that you said there. I agree with everything that you said, and it kind of also at the same time points to how difficult this problem, I say problem, how difficult doing this work is, or how difficult working with other people is fundamentally. Um, which is when you said that how can we make being wrong? How can you make being wrong safe? And um, my stupid, unhelpful brain instantly jumps to, do we know what right is? um, which again gets back to the, okay, well, do we know what kind of problem that we're trying to solve? And then do we know that directionally that's the right kind of problem?
Hmm.
This whole thing about wrong, um, I have experienced one. I would kind of like to describe it as one of the ultimate hard mode. How do you get people to start measuring something because they're scared of the result? I fell into, trying to fix a $500 million modernization project in California, like right up at the level of, psychologically terrifying, which was for their child welfare system. So the computer system that underpins the delivery of child welfare in the biggest state in the US. And at the time, I was like, no biggie, that's like all of the UK. That's fine. Um, and one of the ways that I got into exec leadership on just changing the way that they were going to think about the modernization and the procurement and the fact that exec leadership, the degree to which they were outsourcing it to the vendor, which again was completely reasonable because over decades they'd hollowed out any kind of internal capability to understand or manage or direct the product, was you cannot do child welfare without this computer system. So the extent to which you are outsourcing this to a vendor or even, a different department that's not inside, you know, healthcare and health and social services, that's an abrogation of your responsibility because you just couldn't do it with pen and paper. The entire system wouldn't work. And when it came down to it, we'd made some terrific progress. We had set up a digital service for child welfare. We'd hired, we'd put in place a director of user research. We'd kind of managed to persuade everyone what we really need is something that's going to meet the needs of the caseworkers. It's going to need to meet the needs of the families. We need to understand all of this. And then when it came down to it, we're trying to plan out how are we going to start rolling this out and how are we going to start testing it with caseworkers and how are we going to know if we're moving in the right direction. And the service director is like, well, one of the metrics is fewer kids die in our care, when it comes down to it. And it's like, and we get the reports, we get the emails every day. It's like, did any kids die in our care overnight? And we do a bunch of user research. And there are some counties where they're caught in this bind, right? If they look under the rock, they're going to find out reasons why kids die, like what our user researchers found in ride alongs. It's like, there's stuff that's been sitting on the file for 6 weeks because someone's been too busy, or they will say that the existing system takes like 3 hours to sync back to the DB2 database, right? Which means that they won't tolerate anything other than live sync with any new solution. 5-minute latency, 30-second latency, not good enough, but the stuff that's on the table has already been sitting there for 6 weeks or so. And they don't want to know because if you start wanting to look at the actual numbers, and that's one of the extremes, it's like, but then we'll find out that we're doing not as good a job as we want to. And it took, I was going to say months, it can take years to get an organization like that when it's, at that level of problem to go, you go into meetings and you say, we all agree that we want to get better. That's why we're here. There is no way that we can get better without knowing where we are. And it was countless meetings. And sometimes it came down to, I talk about identifying influence. It's one person who ends up representing, a group of 10 of those counties. And that one person might not be psychologically in a place, and they may feel so much pressure to be able to go, well, no way. If any of my counties, if I heard from one caseworker that a 30-second lag is going to be too much, then there's no way. And then that's where my job gets interesting because it's like, okay, so I'm going to go to the secretary, and I'm going to get the secretary to tell you that we have to do this, and that's the way that this is going to need to go. Dorian's saying that hit a ceiling and then you become a management consultant, and I find that rude and also hurtful psychologically. But people don't. It's scary to look under the rock, right?
Yeah, it's I think those systemic overhauls are the kind of thing that everyone thinks they're going to want to do. And honestly, I think it's Dorian's point, a management consultant coming in once someone's already identified the need for change is one of the only people actually empowered to do this. This was one of the nice things about working at Amazon. I was in the professional services side of the house, and that's exactly what it was. We came in and we would be an advisory group for making big systemic changes, but we weren't the ones who determined that there was a necessity to do that in the first place. And so coming in and actually already having an executive sponsor and alignment done for you, it was awesome. Everything else about that job sucked, but that one part was great.
And yeah, so when I come in, so that's part of what I do when I come in and do turnaround. So there are times when I come in, a team will call me when they're stuck. Uh, and a lot of the time, what it comes down to is understanding the problem and generating that alignment by getting everyone up the chain to understand and agree on this is the problem that we're trying to solve, right? Did you know that this team actually has a pretty good idea of solving that problem? And to do that, they would need to do XYZ. And then the next person up the chain is like, oh wow, cool. Yeah, I can support that. I didn't know that. I didn't know that they had a way of doing that, or I didn't know that that was one of the technical problems involved. Or I wasn't able to listen to that. Um, Peter also said something um, interesting in there about how you know he feels like some successful UX senior UX people in UX roles end up being a bit like management consultants. I want to go back to something that's been kind of stuck in my head and being itching there about something that Yvonne Lam said um, about sometimes there's situations when there's domains like someone saying, wait for the stakeholders to show up with a technical problem. And then that might be reasonable, but that's not been true in their particular domain and experience. And I'm just trying to kind of figure that through in my head and what kind of shape of organization produces problems like that. Do you have any thoughts on that? I'm still trying to figure it out.
Can you reframe that question? I'm not sure I really understood.
Let's see. Let's see. So, Yvonne said, I don't know how many other senior technical people have told me you shouldn't take on a project unless a stakeholder can present you with a technical problem. And then she said that she doesn't entirely agree in that she doesn't think stakeholders are
Mhm.
equipped to go from the business problem to a technical problem.
Oh, I
So,
see.
yeah,
I I feel like in a way it's almost the reverse, where stakeholders are actually pretty good at finding technical problems. And I use the word stakeholder quite broadly because a lot of them are going to be in product or in engineering, and they come in and say, "Here's this cool thing we can build."
hmm,
And I mean, I saw this at Amazon a lot because this was the peak of 2023, like LLM mania,
hmm,
and tons of companies came to us and said, "We want AI."
right,
And that is the definition of a technical problem. Cool, we can, set something up, we can ingest your data, we can do a chatbot for you, but why? And then the conversation stalls because they don't know why. They want the solution to a technical problem because it is a technical problem they want to solve. It's completely circular. So I actually think that we're very good at finding technical solutions to business problems. Um, Identifying the business problem that is actually worth solving is a completely different thing that the stakeholders should be doing themselves,
yes,
or at least the business stakeholders. Because the problem with the technical framing of what you're doing is you don't actually know how to prioritize it. And this is a huge
right,
thing that, I spent some time in the PM world, and so I think about this a lot, but I think even a lot of PMs don't, is prioritization is the job. And you can
hmm,
only prioritize if you know what the value of doing
right.
that piece of work is. Um, I mean, it's a different question of thinking about how long it's going to take and what the cost of doing it is. But at the very least, figuring out what do we get from solving this? And from a lot of technical problems, you get nothing out of solving it other than resume-driven development as an incentive for hiring. That like, oh, come to our company, you will get to work on AI, and you'll get to
Right.
put on your resume that you're working on AI. Like, cool, great, okay, sure. What's the value to the company of people working on AI within the company? And I mean, we're seeing the studies come in now where the answer is, I believe, like a 1.3% increase in productivity, something
Or
like
or
that.
a or a or a loss, I suspect, in some cases.
I mean, that is a completely different conversation. But to me, the reason that prioritization is so important is that the biggest cost, like we talk about, design reduces the risks of being wrong. The biggest cost to me is opportunity cost,
Right.
uh, which is if I do this work, it doesn't matter how productive I am. I could be doing some other piece of work. Like
Yeah.
if it takes me 5 minutes to ship out a new feature, well, that's 5 minutes I didn't spend on a different feature. And so what is it that is actually going to move the needle is a question you can only answer if you have framed the problem from a business point of view, that how much money essentially are we going to make on this?
When it comes down
You
to it,
know,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, or what any other number. I mean, Dorian's right in the comments that money is a metric, um, and different companies set different time horizons for how they measure that metric. But at the end of the day, all comes down to how much money are you going to make on this in the in the time scale that you care about. So it's something that stakeholders need to do. It's their job, and they often don't do it. They often skip to the technical thing. Um, and if you want to build trust, if that's the thing that you're focusing on at
Mm,
that point in time, then yeah, absolutely, go for it. Do the thing as a favor, and then use it as currency to get something
exactly.
you want back. Because if you don't do that, what happens is you become known as the guy who just does favors.
Right.
And sort of the compromiser, and you end up compromising your entire practice. And we actually, I think, have a lot of senior people in the industry who spend the last 15 years or last 20 years even doing exactly that and getting
Hmm.
promoted, and then treating the design org basically as a way to get favors. And so they got their seat at the table, but they don't do anything with it. And they've kind of structurally made themselves unable to do anything with it to the point that now when their authority and their ownership of the domain is challenged, when companies say, actually, why don't we just AI, the work that your team has been doing, they can't push back. They didn't build up that power base. All of their trust was spent on bolstering themselves to the point where, they got the rank, but they can't actually do
Right.
anything with it in a way that matters.
And it feels like ultimately reinforcing the idea that design is a cost center.
Yes.
There is, I'm going to go sideways a bit when,
Hmm.
and rewind a little bit when you were talking about the example of someone coming to you and saying, we need to put AI in this somewhere.
Hmm.
And then not having a reason for it, which I agree is true. But then there is another reason for it, which is my boss needs me to have AI in this, and that there
Hmm.
are social pressures for me to be able to put AI in this. And there's a gig that I am putting together a proposal about right now, and then I had a briefing with actually the person who's above the client on this, and they're saying, you know what, I know you. They're going to want to do a lot of AI stuff. The money is on the table, and they're going to want to do it. And then
Hmm.
I think, like you're saying, it's okay. Well, is there a way that this can be used to actually solve a problem? It may not be the best way, and I'll stipulate that there are all of the ethical and ecological impacts and externalities involved in that. But ultimately, it comes down to, I think, a reality is that an option that you can decide to take or to refuse is how much will I collaborate and how much will I compromise this time in order to strategically gain something that I can use tactically next time. right?
Hmm.
It's like I figured out a way to use AI. Maybe I can get even so far as not using an LLM in a shitty way, and then maybe use a vision language model in a way that is useful and is more appropriate to the task, right? And then everyone can
Yeah,
look like they won.
hmm exactly. And this is really where that question of technical problem versus business problem comes into play. Because if the actual problem they're solving is put on our website that we use AI, that's one question. If what they want to do is reduce, processing times, reduce costs, reduce headcounts, that's a classic automation use case that we've had for decades, ever since, uh, like very early automation work and expert systems and all those things kind of started happening in the 60s. So, um, if all they want is automation, I think a lot of executives just realize that automation is possible, generally speaking.
Right.
And a lot of the automation they want to do doesn't need an LLM at all. It can be done through, your old-fashioned if this and that kind
Yeah.
of integration. The biggest problem with all of these companies, including my own, is that we don't have the data to actually do any automation. The work happens in people's heads. The work happens in Google spreadsheets. The work happens on a calculator someone's pulled out because nothing is productized, nothing is standardized, and nothing is in a system. And so,
which is which I'm just going to say is hilarious given how excited people were about dashboards a while ago,
yes,
right?
yeah, it's very, very funny. And so a lot of the work, like you can do AI in a shitty way, which is what most people have done. And now there's a chatbot, and the chatbot doesn't interact with the rest of the system in any way, and it's kind of useless, but it's there for
Yeah,
you to press a button and talk to it and demo it to an executive, and then collect your paycheck. Or you can say, to do this for real, we are going to need to actually ingest all of the knowledge that we have, which means we first have to structure all the knowledge that we have
right.
and put it in one place, reconcile it, make sure that it's not mutually contradicting. And that work is going to take you years and years. By the time that it comes to actually do some AI to it, maybe it will not be, the trendy thing to do. Maybe the models will be a little bit less horrible or, any number of things. It's like the old joke about teaching the donkey how to read. Um, if you give a long enough time horizon, either you will die or the donkey will die or the person who hired you will die, and then you're scot-free.
Yeah. Perversely, I have seen domains where the LLM and structured knowledge and extraction has been stupendously useful, which has been in the government social services space. So, for example,
Hmm.
I know I go on about it a lot, but things like unemployment insurance and all of the different rules that go into whether you are eligible or whether you qualify for unemployment insurance. Fortunately, people have written a whole bunch of legislation and regulations about this. The entire industry has been built on trying to, the entire technology industry has been built on trying to figure out how to turn those into, how to encode those into business rules, and then
Hmm.
present them in an accessible way, or in what they think is an accessible way. Plus, there is a body of human reviewed cases and where decisions have been made. And what the smart people have been doing has been writing all the evals that an LLM would need to pass if, when you ask it a question about, am I eligible for this thing, then it's like, actually, we know you should be. So if you've come up with this answer, then that's wrong. And then we need to fine tune the model a little bit more. So it has been, it's just mildly funny to me where the reputation that government and technology gets can be so bad in some cases, but there are some kind of like wonderful and also pro-social domains where it's like, actually, this is demonstrably and quantifiably really helpful in helping people get the benefits that they are legally entitled to have, and that's kind of heartwarming. Um, Dan Turner asked if we'd seen any evidence of compromise allowing room for better work later. and I have a little bit of a story about this. I was asked to come in. It wasn't necessarily a turnaround, but it was an external team who had come in to, this is another great example. The director had been told, and the organization had agreed that DevOps is a good thing. And it's like, well, you're not wrong. It could be a good thing. And they had been brought in, they were supporting, a bunch of application teams, some of which were brand new and some of which were very, very old, maintaining legacy products that were probably going to be modernized at some point. And their first year of work was basically make work, right? You can imagine the kind of stuff that you would do that would be okay, but not the work that they would want to do and not what a capable senior team would have prioritized strategically to bring about a better, more effective DevOps culture within a general understanding of the business problem. And this was for like processing of Medicare and Medicaid transactions and that kind of thing. So they did a bunch of mate work, and their client, the DevOps director was super happy with them because they shipped stuff. They got asked for a thing, they shipped the thing, and this team knew that no one would use it because although it was a thing that you would see on the top right of a Gartner quadrant, it's like, yeah, that makes sense, but the organization isn't set up to use it. So they had compromised almost to the extent, I would say, of burnout. And they knew that they had a whole bunch of trust, but they couldn't figure out how or what to use that with. And then I worked with them over a few months. And then we got to the point where the director of the entire organization was able to stand in front of everyone and say, it is important to us to meet the needs of our business stakeholders to be able to do a deployment during the daytime with zero downtime. Like that's the goal that we want our application teams to hit. We know that you say that you can do daytime zero downtime deployments, but we found that you're doing them with runbooks, right? And that they're not repeatable every time and that you can easily make mistakes with them and that you have made mistakes with them. So for each and every application team, we want to look at strategically what it will take for you to get there. We've given you a clear goal, right? And then this team, their job, they are empowered to work across all of the application teams and then to build common infrastructure that's going to help you achieve that. But without having built we did the thing that the director of DevOps asked us to do because honestly, the director of DevOps couldn't think of anything else to do and essentially had no power to direct application teams whatsoever because they'd come in late. They were sitting off to the side, and there was no reason to listen to them because the director of the entire org had never said or never articulated other than we've got one now why DevOps and what it could do was important to the organization. It was only when she understood, she's like, we're on the hook to other departments at CMS to make software that meets their needs. And we do a better job when we understand what they need and they get what they need faster. And the way for us to do that is to be able to safely deploy. And that took like 6 months. And it took, to kind of like give some more context to Dan, I was able to teach the team how to figure out and realize how to do that, but I will completely acknowledge that it may well have required latitude that they didn't have because it required like things like one-on-ones with their client to get their client to kind of admit. I mean, I got the client to admit this, but like I went into the client with a one-on-one early and was like, you can't get anyone to do anything, can you? Like, no, my job fucking sucks. Like, we could be doing all this DevOps stuff. I've got some ideas, but no one will do it because the app teams weren't willing to prioritize, to your point, any fundamental foundational DevOps work that would make their job easier later. Like,
Yeah, I think that this sounds exactly like every designer um, back in, you know, the design thinking times when people, airdropped them into an organization. They're like, cool, can you do design thinking now? Like, we heard about all this stuff where Nike is worth a lot of money and Apple is worth a lot of money, and we'd like to be worth a lot of money too. Okay, now go and do that.
Nike got the
And
CEO of ServiceNow in. That was the weirdest thing when that happened. Sorry.
yeah.
I had Nike as a client at the time at the ad agency that I was with them. And I was like, this is, I guess they're trying to do digital now.
Yes.
Yeah,
So and it's exactly the same problem that the system is not set up to do the work that matters. And so, you can compromise and you can do all the work that doesn't matter and earn trust, but you can never cash it out.
right.
You need to create the incentive or get the incentive created for teams to switch the way they work, which is comfortable and nice, to a new way, which is risky and scary. And it might turn out that actually they're doing the wrong thing. They've been doing the wrong thing for a very long time. So it's really, a situation where you need to create the system around the work itself before you can actually do good design work. And it relies on getting other people to change how they behave, which is very, very difficult in a situation where their current behavior is rewarded.
Yes. Yeah. You end up having to incept, or at least in my experience, um, get achieving what I
Hmm.
think needs to be done ends up requiring kind of incepting a whole bunch of people's minds. Uh, Dan
Yeah.
Turner has got his hand up. Dan.
Yeah, thanks for describing all that down in the conditions. So it sounds, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you were dealing with really, I hate to be reductionist to all this, but really siloed conditions with teams, et cetera, being striated and separated. If that's the case, did you find that people were open to creating new channels or having new channels of communication? I found that in government work that people are really engaged in wanting to, uh, you know, um, work together in new ways, but they're just awful busy. In private companies, I found it's often, oh no, this isn't the way we do things. We can't do that. It'll add more overhead.
I've got a shitty answer, which is it depends. And it's highly context dependent. Even inside of the government work, it has been there are some application teams with, and I'll generalize massively here, um, newer product managers or newer service managers who, I guess to your point, are more open to ways of doing things because it has nothing to do with age and it has nothing to do with years of experience, right? They don't necessarily correlate that way. And then there are others who will just absolutely be, you know, I don't get the problem. We're doing it right. What do you mean? We can totally do like we can already do a deployment in daytime with zero downtime, and then I'll look at that and go, it's not even worth saying, but you didn't last week. Like that's not productive. And in that particular case, for me, it's like the way that that team will do what we need them to do is because the way that that manager will manage that team towards that goal is if they are told to.
Hmm.
And then when it got down to it, it was so again, this was a vendor team coming in, right? And they would be like, this app dev team manager is just really bad at their job, and we don't know what to do, and they shouldn't be doing that job. Um, and I said, you need to be able to tell your client that because it's your client's job. It's not your job to performance manage the app dev manager. It is your client's job to manage that. There is someone in the org chart whose job it is to manage that, but they can't do their job well unless they know that. And you are a domain expert. You know what you're doing. You've brought in because you know what you're doing, and then the organization should act as if they are trusting you. So if you have valuable information that a rationally acting manager should be using and can accept and understand that they should be using to manage someone else so that everyone can succeed, then you need to be able to tell them that. and then I dealt with that all the way up because honestly, in an organization like this, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same in the private sector, going up to the director of the entire thing, you know, they know in abstract that DevOps is a good thing, but they've never had the time, I would bet. 90% of the time, I would bet they've never had the time to be able to viscerally internally connect that to what is good, to what their part of the business is supposed to be doing. They're like, this is a best practice that I've seen on the Gartner chart, so we should be doing it. But without that internal understanding, there's no social authority that comes, I think, from them saying, oh, yeah, and we should be doing DevOps. And then suddenly you have it, you know, in a strategy chart, and suddenly you have it in an OKR. And then before you know it, you've got metrics that everyone's driving towards that mean absolutely nothing and are the make work there.
Yeah, I think that's the big problem. There's two big problems there. One is aligning around a goal is not really that meaningful because you'll see this in workshops all the time. You bring something up like, oh, we should do automation. We should do, um, transparency, all those things. They're like, yeah, that's awesome. Let's do it. And then everyone just goes back to their day job.
Right.
They come out the door and it's like they traveled from fairyland back to the real world, and now, all of that was like a dream that never happened. So bridging that is hugely important. And then the other thing is best practices, which to me is one of the reddest flags you could possibly have. Because the wonderful thing about a best practice is a best practice can replace a goal.
Yes.
And it's exactly like you said. I see this with Agile all the time. It's like, here's this big book about Agile, how to do Agile dot book. You open it, it says, number one, you must do this. And so as long as you are doing that, you're doing the ceremonies,
You're
you're doing
doing
the two
agile,
week
right? Yeah.
sprints, you're doing, yeah, like, well, here's our OKR. We're doing Agile. We succeeded. And then you look at, did any of your like work actually change? Did you hit the, improvements in whatever you were trying to do, which is usually velocity for some reason, even though Agile doesn't say anything about velocity. And the answer is no. But we're doing Agile right. And people have this attachment to processes and methods that overrides their ability to achieve things. It's like we must do the correct way of doing things, and
Right.
then that's good, even if the correct way of doing things is actually not successful. And you see designers fall in this trap all the time because they're like, this is my process. I'm going to do the design process in order in these steps. And usually you end up making people super mad because it's not compatible with your current situation. It's not compatible with the way that you get out of the problem you're in. And quite frankly, at this point in time, this is commodity grade stuff.
Yeah.
If doing agile was going to rescue your company, it wouldn't be in this mess anymore. It would have figured
Right.
out how to do agile 20 years ago. If they're not yet successful, it means that something else is going on. And what you should be doing is archaeology. You should be going and figuring out when we tried this thing, what stopped it from working. Don't assume it hasn't been tried. Don't assume that this
Yeah.
is the first time the company has heard of design. They've heard about it. I'm sure they've employed designers, even if they've laid all of them off now.
Right.
And now they're asking you to do this. Well, what have we already tried, and what did we learn from it? Because a lot of the time we learn nothing,
Yeah.
and we just keep repeating the same mistakes and cashing in the checks from those mistakes over and over. And that's not really helping anybody. It's iterative, but if you just keep doing the same thing over and over again, you have to actually learn from it and feed that back into what you're doing. Otherwise, it's garbage.
I found that that's a really powerful concept to introduce at the right time, or to kind of grim worm tongue whisper into someone's ear, into the right person's ear at the right time, which is to say, those exact points. Um, has it worked before? Are we trying to do the same thing that hasn't worked, but we're trying even harder? And also, one of my pithy versions, which is agile is the way to do the wrong thing faster. Like it doesn't actually help us figure out what we're doing the thing for. It is just a way of it is just, that kind of best practice, that kind of best practice process. Dan, actually, Dorian, do you still have your hand up?
Yeah. this was actually from a while back, but I was just sort of thinking because I was just thinking about the um I guess it's sort of an adjacent phenomenon to the Chesterton fence. Like, why is this thing here?
Mm.
Um, and vis-a-vis metrics and agile velocity, these kinds of concepts that people just kind of parrot them, but like they don't have any sense of the provenance of why any of that exists. Why is this metric a salient metric, for example? And I wonder to the extent that, and this is something that I'm actively wondering in my own practice, the extent that like if you knew why this metric was a metric, like would you still blindly try to meet the metric, for instance? Like, is that a like does that make sense at all? Like if you understood like, oh, we're using this metric as a proxy for this other thing. And so we want to make that number go up because the theory behind the metric is that this other thing is also going up that we want. But that's not, we can't measure that. We're measuring this other thing instead. And so the sort of like metrics chasing, I think, has just in my sort of vibes, a sort of relationship to how the like the metrics are conceived, I guess, because a metric is like you can't count anything unless it's all the same, right? You can't have two things that, one apple plus one orange does not make two apple oranges, right? Like you've got to normalize it somehow, circular fruit. I don't know. Um, but like, coming up with a metric is a management job. And so the question, I guess, is sort of like if everybody on the team knew how this metric came to be in a concise and synoptic way, would it would it grant the permission to make it easier to say, actually, this metric is totally dumb in this context?
I mean, I think unfortunate reality is most metrics are set because they saw someone else measuring that metric and they're like, cool, that's awesome. Let's do that because it beats thinking about what makes our situation
It's
different.
easier,
Uh,
right? You don't
exactly.
have to think.
So it's
And
precisely
that's
the
also
not.
the case with a lot of features that like, oh, I saw that this is on Slack or I saw this is on Facebook. Let's add it to our product. Um, why? Well, they did it, so it must be a good idea.
That and that I feel like that comes back to one of the underlying themes here, which is how, when, if ever, what does it take to create an environment to have a conversation about that, and to just start introducing that, by whichever way. And it helps if you have, for lack of a better term, a theory of change framework. It works
Hmm.
better if you have an idea or you have some sort of plan about how it will all fit together. And what I found is that some people who do well, they do bits and pieces of it instinctively, which can feel great. But you can be deliberately and intentionally more successful if you're able to go, okay, right, I understand that it would be more effective. It could be a better use of my time if I do that in this order, or I need to know, or I know that these people need to understand or change their thinking in this area this much, so that they can persuade someone else, for example.
And in the process, protect everybody's egos whose egos need protecting.
It's always nice. Well, I will say, but then sometimes not. Again, coming in from the outside, I had that example of the app dev manager who was like, I don't get it. You're wrong. We don't need to do that. We're doing great. We're fantastic. And again, coming in as a consultant, I will give people the benefit of the doubt. I'll do it 3 times, right? And then after the third time, I'm like, you've made your decision. I disagree, right? It is your management team's decision, and I'm going to let them know that you are being actively that you're doing something like actively obstructing, or you're just not qualified for the job. And from the outside, being able to say that, because I can say that from the outside. I think internally you might be able to imply it, and it's always nicer and less political to be able to state facts, right? And to take emotion out of it and just be to be factual about it in that way.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people struggle with when trying to drive this kind of change is they talk to the wrong people.
Mm,
And they basically talk to the people who are obvious. And it's like, oh, the product manager said, I can't do this. Well, the product manager is not the CEO of their product. That's not a real thing. That's a
no.
thing people made up on LinkedIn to feel good about themselves. Everyone everyone is influenced by other parts of the organization. And so this is actually one of the things in the workshop that we're going to talk about next week is you need to be targeting people who are unhappy in the organization, whoever they are, wherever they are, whatever level they're at. If someone's unsatisfied with the status quo, that is the person you must talk to. If someone is satisfied with the status quo, you will never get them to change anything about how they work.
Right.
But if someone's unhappy, figure out what's making them unhappy, come to them with a solution. Say, hey, I also want, this number to go up. Here's what I think we can do differently that we haven't tried before. And this is really important. You have to give them some reason to have faith that your thing is going to work when their thing hasn't worked. You need to say, this is going, we will see this happening if what we are doing is working. You need essentially a leading indicator, but
Right.
on an organizational scale. I mean, not necessarily. It can also be if you're making a product change, it can be a product leading indicator, like, hey, we're going to see fewer error rates or whatever in this interface. But basically, just you need to convince them to do it differently
Yeah.
for long enough to see a result that is indicative that you're moving in the right direction. And the sooner that result happens within your plan, the better.
Yep.
If your result is going to come up within a year, they're like, well, my thing is going to work this time for real, for sure,
Yeah.
on that time scale. So we'll just do mine. But
Right.
if you need a month to prove that your way is different, or a week, or one user test, it's much easier to sell that. And they're like, oh, okay, there's something to it now. Um, they can see their interest reflected in what you're trying to do.
One of the ways that that one of the reasons why I figured out I enjoy the work that I do is because it feels like I'm conducting a heist. And the the reason why I say that is because when you're doing a heist, you put together the right crew for the right job. And I don't like the word alignment because it's a shitty management consulting business term. But I think what you're describing there, Pavel, is you don't need to see that as creating alignment, but you're discovering alignment. You're discovering other people who have the same problem as you have, and that you're actually all on the same side. So it doesn't need to feel like that you're having to create something that didn't exist before. It is incredibly likely that there is someone else who has a problem in the same domain
Mm-hmm.
as you, that they want to do something different. And where I see this where I've personally seen this in some of the most painful situations has been when you've got exec leadership who feel all of the burden of that, and they don't feel like they've got any other choice than to do the thing that they are already doing, which they
Mm-hmm.
know has already failed because they're in charge of the thing, and it's not knowing instinctively, it's not going the way instinctively that they would like it to be going, but they haven't had a credible, workable alternative yet. And I think that credible part, speaks to a component of that credible part, speaks to what you're talking about, which is I need to see a series of results within an amount of time. I cannot, the reality of the situation is that I cannot wait a year to see something.
Mm-hmm.
I need to see that improvement. And if they are willing, or if they are encountering enough pain for that to have gone above the activation energy threshold to try to feel safe enough to do something different, then I think that's where that kind of thing happen. Later on in a few, I think maybe like 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I've got a couple of people on Matthew Weaver, who's part of a group called Layer Aleph, and they've written a book called Crisis Engineering, which in that specific case is all about how you can use emergencies, or how emergencies or crises are kind of points that you can say, right, now the organization is experiencing enough pain that they are willing to do something different, or that, for example, exec leadership is like, turns out we can just do that thing, and we can decide to just do that thing because the risk threshold has changed. But I think absolutely there. It's like alignment isn't necessarily about going out and finding new people to persuade, which is a way that I think a lot of people might understand it. It's not like, oh great, I've got to Jedi mind trick a bunch of people to get them to do what I want to do. It's, you know what, there probably are people who do want to do what you want to do, and you need to make that a way you can be successful is, like Peter said, you could make that legible, you know um and it can be something that you can approach it like a coordination problem, or you can like be weird like me. You can say, yeah, I'm putting my heist crew together for this for this product feature that we think could make a substantive change.
Yeah, and I think honestly, the extent to which what they want is aligned with what you want doesn't have to be very big at all. I think
No.
that generally speaking, the mandate to be doing something is sufficient for you to then also do the thing that you want to do.
Yeah.
And as long as it's sort of aligned, like I think there's a big area of people who are essentially indifferent to anything, to what's
Yes.
being done or how to do it.
Yep.
And absent any other pressure, they will keep doing it the current way.
Yep.
If there's a reason to do it the new way, they're going to do it the new way.
Yep.
They don't care. And so if you can introduce that new way within the context of something that they're already doing, they're perfectly happy, or within the context of something they want, it's like, oh, and also we're doing it this way. All right. I think this was a John Cutler thing originally, but he was talking about how do you introduce, for example, metrics into a company that has essentially been doing feature factory stuff forever, is you do the feature factory work, because if you don't do it, you'll get fired. But at the same time, in parallel, in your decks or whatever, you can also do the good work, the real work, and you can show that, hey, we did it. We sort of hit the minimum, which is doing the thing we're asked to do, and then we did these other things, and people are going to start realizing that, oh, actually, that's better. I should do that too, or I can talk to this person and get them to do this for me because it's awesome, and like the story you can tell is much better. Um, Contrasted with someone who comes in and says, I'm going to improve the maturity of my design, of the design org in this company. I'm going to, make the product org awesome. Well,
Hmm.
that is a change management initiative that takes dozens of people years to do.
Right.
You're not going to do it by yourself, and you're
No.
certainly not going to do it in time before people realize you're not doing any of the work they're asking you to do.
I think this nicely is a way to kind of loop back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of this. One thing that I want to say first is that I have absolutely seen that kind of rule that you're talking about, of most people will just go along with whatever. So I've consistently seen, and it's not quite like 1 9 90, but it is like there is a vast
Hmm.
majority, and then there are small groups at either end. There is a small group at one end, which is, I understand I need to do something different, but I don't know what it is. I don't have the support for it, but I am ready to do something different. I just need a little bit
Hmm.
of an enabler, or I just need a little bit of an
Yeah.
environment change. And then at the other end, there are the people who are like, fuck you, I know what to do. I'm not going to change what I'm doing. And you need to be able to have a plan to deal with them, or you need to have a plan, or you need to have an approach that's going to take into account that that's just going to happen anyway. And then in the middle, you've got this mass of people who are like, you want me to do that? Cool, we'll do that. Like, just tell me
Hmm.
what to do, and then I'll go along with it, because that's what we're doing. So I consistently see, you know, that kind of rough heuristic of, this is how an organization works. I talked about tying this back right to the very beginning, which was we were talking about that bias for action, and then you can have like one charismatic individual who comes up with the first thing, right? And then they kind of accrete a group around them, and then before you know it, you're doing the thing that doesn't make any sense.
Hmm.
Um, and I think what you were talking about right now about discovering those people, how most people, you might be surprised at how little they need to be aligned with your specific problem. They are just looking for an excuse to be able to do things differently. That's a
Hmm.
really great crack in the door for building up your own coalition to effectively neuter the guy, invariably a guy, um, who came up with the thing to do, and everyone would otherwise go, okay, yeah, I guess we're doing that thing now.
Yeah, I think it's very tempting to try and fight them in the same way that they act.
Yeah.
But I think that you kind of need to basically undermine the conceptual base
Yes.
under which doing a thing just really, really quickly makes sense. And I think that showing a better way of doing things is a very effective counterbalance of that because people will come in, I'm doing this thing, I'm building this feature. But if you've inoculated enough decision makers, they're going to be like, oh, well, I saw that, Dan showed this like metrics thing last week. That was cool. How does this drive the metric? And they can't answer that question.
Yeah.
And you didn't have to build a competing product or, you know, do designs faster than they could. You were able to just to do something different, to build a foundation for doing actually good work. And then now future fastest guns are all going to bounce off of this exact same barrier. So there's little things like that that you can establish without trying to, up level everyone. But it really requires like who are the key people.
Yeah.
And honestly, one of the things that I've always struggled with is you're never going to be able to make that all of your work. I
No.
think that especially if you're working across an organization, most of the things you're going to be doing is just like baseline feature factory stuff. Um, and that's okay. Don't put any energy into them. Like people, if there's no bar for good, don't do good work.
Mm.
The 20/80 rule applies to everything. Do the bare minimum that will work and spend your energy on like the one place where you can actually do good work that you're proud of or move that needle of maturity in the direction that you want to move in. And then hopefully over time you'll be able to spread the impacts of that or at least get more of the good work and less of the bad work. But I think people try to spread themselves too thin and do everything at the same time
Yeah.
and it never actually works.
Well, we came back to that thing, that you talked about, which is prioritization and focus,
Hmm.
and that's just really difficult to do when you're underwater, on fire, you're being attacked um, from all sides. You have all of the unread Slack or Teams messages, plus you have the email, and then there's all the shit to do
Hmm.
with in Confluence. I will. I'm looking at the time, and so I will practice my marketing because is what I'm supposed to do. Um, by saying that a lot of what we've been talking about can feel obvious. It can feel like, oh yeah, right, I'm supposed to do that. That makes sense. Um, and when I work with people, I'm like, yeah, you know that if you could do that, you would be doing that. So there are reasons why it is difficult for you to implement those tactics and do those things in your day-to-day work. Because Pavel and I can say, do what you need to get by on 80% and then spend the 20% on the stuff that matters. Um, I'll say, Pavel's going to have this great workshop on Friday next week that you should absolutely go to if you're in Philadelphia or if you're in traveling distance of Philadelphia and there are no anthropogenic climate change disasters that will impede you. And you can get your manager to pay for it. But the way that I've structured the workshop and the reason why my workshop takes 4 weeks is that we spend the first session in the week where we're teaching you and we're learning about these techniques. And then the second session, the next 90 minutes is people bring their live work, right? And we're able to go, the next email that you're going to send, you're going to do it differently this way. The deck for your next meeting, because of what we've been learning this week, we're going to look at it together. We will do the crit, right? And then you're going to think about what you will need to do differently. The next meeting that you're going to have, you're going to do some homework, or we're going to do the homework in the session, because I know you just don't have the time. So just by doing it for the first time is that first step of, okay, well, tell me about the person you're meeting with. Who do they need to persuade, right? And what are the ways in which they may not have the tools or the language or the ability to persuade whomever for them to succeed in supporting you to get the good thing done that everyone wants to do. So one of the things that I love about the workshop that I put together, also it works great for my brain, is that I get a bunch of new problems every week, and people are like, this thing's happening, what do we do here? And we can go through, okay, well, this is what you could do differently, and this is an approach that you can try. So if you've got a manager who's got budget, you should talk to them and point them towards Pavel's direction and my direction. How's that? 10:28. We've got like probably 90 seconds left.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Pavel, especially. This has been great. Love riffing with you. This session has been recorded. Some point later today, when Zoom has finished its encoding and everything, I'll stick it up on YouTube. Everyone will get an email with the chat log, and sign up for the next ones if you're interested. They're always fun. And you can also find out about the next ones in my newsletter, which you will always also get a link to. So that's it for episode 3. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you especially to Pavel. And we're out.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Stop recording.